大家好啊！咁咧就又係到讀你聽嘅時間啦，好耐都冇讀書俾大家聽啦。咁咧今日咧就想讀呢本書俾大家聽，就係 Agatha Christie 嘅450 from Paddington 啊。咁就我諗原因係因為我有兩本 Agatha Christie 嘅書啦，咁啊都係啲短篇嚟嘅。咁我自己都中意偵探嘅，咁啊今日就想讀呢一本 Paddington 俾大家聽一聽。咁啊之後如果有反應嘅話咧，會讀埋另外嗰本嘅。咁我哋而家讀下呢本書嘅背頁先啦。呢本書嘅出版係 HarperCollins 嚟嘅。咁啊睇下呢本書嘅背面先。呢本書都買咗好耐啦，但係都有啲陳舊發黃啦。咁啊450 from Paddington， 背頁係咁寫嘅，佢話For an instant, the two trains ran together, side by side. In that frozen moment, Elspeth witnessed a murder. Helplessly, she stared out of her carriage window as a man remorselessly tightened his grip around a woman's throat. The body crumpled. Then the other train drew away. But who, apart from Miss Marple, would take her story seriously? After all, there were no suspects, no other witnesses, and no corpse. The Times 就話 never a dull moment。OK， 咁有個 Agatha Christie 嘅小簡介啦。咁呢度有寫嘅背頁嗰度。Agatha Christie was born in Torquay in 1890 and became quite simply the best-selling novelist in history. She wrote 79 crime mysteries and collections and saw her work translated into more languages than Shakespeare.Her enduring success, enhanced by many film and TV adaptations, is a tribute to the timeless appeal of her characters and the unequaled ingenuity of her plots. 咁都冇誇張嘅呢個簡介，即係 Agatha Christie 嘅作品係多啦，同埋就係經常會被現代嘅媒體去改編啊、去節錄啊、去做電影啊、劇啊咁樣。咁我自己都好中意睇佢作品。不過我睇佢嘅作品就唔係因為淨係解謎，其實佢主要都係寫人物啦。佢最深刻嘅地方其實就係寫人物佢哋殺人嘅動機啊，點解會諗唔開啊呢啲嘢。咁即係其實都係其實係要深層去了解嗰個英國當年嗰個 Victorian 呢個年代啦，嗰個社會嗰個構成啦，啲人啊，各人嘅身份嘅衝突啊，一啲歧視、一啲觀念啊，一啲壓迫啊，咁通常都係呢啲唔好嘅嘢先至會衍生出一個殺人動機嘅啫，係咪？好好地就唔會嘅。起碼喺佢嘅 Agatha Christie 嘅書入面，即係多數嘅兇手唔會係因為佢發癲咯，主要係因為佢本身係受到壓抑啊，即係因為各種原因啦、錢啊、情啊、各樣嘢啦。咁我哋就今日就去讀呢個啦，讀呢本書啦，咁樣。呢度都仲有一個打開本書咧，仲有一個小簡介，不如都讀一讀啦。Agatha Christie is known throughout the world as the Queen of Crime. Her books have sold over 1 billion copies in English with another billion in 44 foreign languages.She is the most widely published author of all time, and in any language, outsold only by the Bible and Shakespeare. She is the author of 80 crime novels and short story collections, 19 plays, and 6 novels written under the name of Mary Westmacott. Agatha Christie's first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, was written towards the end of the First World War, in which she served as a VAD. In it, she created Hercule Poirot, the little Belgian detective who was destined to become the most popular detective in crime fiction since Sherlock Holmes. It was eventually published by the Bodley Head in 1920. In 1926, After averaging a book a year, Agatha Christie wrote her masterpiece. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was the first of her books to be published by Collins and marked the beginning of an author-publisher relationship which lasted for 50 years and well over 70 books. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was also the first of Agatha Christie's books to be dramatized under the name Alibi and to have a successful run in London's West End. The Mousetrap, her most famous play of all, opened in 1952 and is the longest-running play in history. Agatha Christie was made a dame in 1971. She died in 1976. Since, when a number of books have been published posthumously, the best-selling novel Sleeping Murder appeared later that year, followed by her autobiography and the short story collections Miss Marple's Final Cases, Problem at Pollensa Bay, and While the Light Lasts. In 1998, Black Coffee was the first of her plays to be novelized by another author, Charles Osborne. 咁呢度睇到佢即係喺戰前，無論係二次大戰前、二次大戰後，都係嗰個創作力都係咁強嘅佢頭先講佢最賣嘅呢一本Murder of Roger Ackroyd， 我就應該冇讀過，冇拜讀過但係就你話喺媒體見到就應該有可能嘅。不過我揀呢兩本書，即係譬如呢一本450 from Paddington， 同埋我另外嗰本應該係叫Sparkling Cyanide， 都係因為我覺得好似冇乜點聽過喎，一啲比較冇咁出名嘅，不如都試下啦。咁呢本書係 first published by Collins 係1957年嘅，即係話呢本書都呢個故事都即係出版以嚟都眨下眼都即係接近70年啦，60幾70年啦，非常之歷史悠久。好啦，咁你開始讀啦 Chapter 1啦。呢本書大概有幾多個 chapter 到咧？20零個啦，24、5到啦，24、5、6。26個 chapter，27個 chapter， 好短嘅啫。OK， 我哋開始啦。Mrs. McGillicuddy panted along the platform in the wake of the porter carrying her suitcase. Mrs. McGillicuddy was short and stout. The porter was tall and free-striding. In addition, Mrs. McGillicuddy was burdened with a large quantity of parcels, the result of a day's Christmas shopping. The race was therefore an uneven one, and the porter turned the corner at the end of the platform whilst Mrs. McGillicuddy was still coming up the straight. Number 1 platform was not at the moment unduly crowded, since the train had just gone out, and in the no man's land beyond, a milling crowd was rushing in several directions at once, to and from undergrounds, left luggage offices, tea rooms, inquiry offices, indicator boards, and the 2 outlets, arrival and departure, to the outside world. Mrs. McGillicuddy and her parcels were buffeted to and fro, but she arrived eventually at the entrance to number 3 platform, and deposited 1 parcel at her feet, whilst she searched her bag for the ticket that would enable her to pass the stern uniformed guardian at the gate. At that moment a voice, raucous yet refined, burst into speech over her head. The train standing at platform 3, the voice told her, is the 4:50 for Brackhampton, Milchester, Waverton, Calville Junction, Rochester, and stations to Chatwith. Passengers for Brackhampton and Milchester travel at the rear of the train. Passengers for Fennequay change at Rochester. The voice shut itself off with a click, and then reopened conversation by announcing the arrival at platform 9 of the 4:35 from Birmingham to Wolverhampton. Mrs. McGillicuddy found her ticket and presented it. The man clipped it, murmured, on the right rear portion. Mrs. McGillicuddy padded up the platform and found her porter looking bored and staring into space, outside the door of the 3rd-class carriage. "Here you are, lady." "I'm travelling first class," said Mrs. McGillicuddy. "You didn't say so," grumbled the porter. His eyes swept her masculine-looking pepper and salt tweed coat disparagingly. Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had said so, did not argue the point. She was sadly out of breath. The porter retrieved the suitcase and marched with it to the adjoining coach, where Mrs. McGillicuddy was installed in solitary splendor. The 4:50 was not much patronized, the first-class clientele preferring either the faster morning express or the 6:40 with dining car. Mrs. McGillicuddy handed the porter his tip, which he received with disappointment, clearly considering it more applicable to third class than a first-class travel. Mrs. McGillicuddy, though prepared to spend money on comfortable travel after a night journey from the north and a day's feverish shopping, was at no time an extravagant tipper. She settled herself back on the plush cushions with a sigh and opened her magazine. 5 minutes later, whistles blew and the train started. The magazine slipped from Mrs. McGillicuddy's hand. Her head dropped sideways. 3 minutes later, she was asleep. She slept for 35 minutes and woke refreshed. Resettling her hat, which had slipped askew, she sat up and looked out of the window at what she could see of the flying countryside. It was quite dark now, a dreary, misty December day. Christmas was only 5 days ahead. London had been dark and dreary. The country was no less so, though occasionally rendered cheerful with its constant clusters of lights as the train flashed through towns and stations. "Serving last tea now," said an attendant, whisking open the corridor like a gin. Mrs. McGillicuddy had already partaken of tea at a large department store. She was for the moment amply nourished. The attendant went on down the corridor, uttering his monotonous cry. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked up at the track where various parcels reposed, with a pleased expression. The face towels had been excellent value and just what Margaret wanted. The space gun for Robbie and the rabbit for Jean were highly satisfactory, and that evening cold tea was just the thing she herself needed, warm but dressy. The pullover for Hector, too. Her mind dwelt with approval on the soundness of the purchases. Her satisfied gaze returned to the window. A train traveling in the opposite direction rushed by with a screech, making the windows rattle and causing her to start. The train clattered over points and passed through a station. Then it began suddenly to slow down, presumably in obedience to a signal. For some minutes it crawled along, then stopped. Presently it began to move forward again. Another up train passed them, though with less vehemence than the first one. The train gathered speed again. At that moment another train, also on the down line, swerved inwards towards them, for a moment with almost alarming effect. For a moment the two trains ran parallel, now one gaining a little, now the other. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked from her window through the windows of the parallel carriages. Most of the blinds were down, but occasionally the occupants of the carriages were visible. The other train was not very full, and there were many empty carriages. At a moment when the two trains gave the illusion of being stationary, a blind in one of the carriages flew up with a snap. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked into the lighted first-class carriage that was only a few feet away. Then she drew her breath in with a gasp and half rose to her feet. Standing with his back to the window and to her was a man. His hands were round the throat of a woman who faced him, and he was slowly, remorselessly strangling her. Her eyes were starting from their sockets. Her face was purple and congested. As Mrs. McGillicuddy watched fascinated, the end came. The body went limp and crumpled in the man's hands. At the same moment, Mrs. McGillicuddy's train slowed down again, and the other began to gain speed. It passed forward, and a moment or two later, it had vanished from sight. Almost automatically, Mrs. McGillicuddy's hand went up to the communication cord, then paused, irresolute. After all, what use would it be ringing the cord of the train in which she was traveling? The horror of what she had seen at such close quarters and the unusual circumstances made her feel paralyzed. Some immediate action was necessary. But what? The door of her compartment was drawn back, and the ticket collector said, "Ticket, please." Mrs. McGillicuddy turned to him with vehemence. "A woman has been strangled," she said, "in a train that has just passed. I saw it." The ticket collector looked at her undoubtedly. "I beg your pardon, madam." "A man strangled a woman in a train. I saw it, through there." She pointed to the window. The ticket collector looked extremely doubtful. "Strangled?" he said disbelievingly. "Yes, strangled. I saw it, I tell you. You must do something at once." The ticket collector coughed apologetically. "You don't think, madam, that you may have had a little nap and he broke off tactfully. "I have had a nap, but if you think this was a dream, you are quite wrong. I saw it, I tell you." The ticket collector's eyes dropped to the open magazine lying on the seat. On the exposed page was a girl being strangled whilst a man with a revolver threatened the pair from an open doorway. He said persuasively, "Now, don't you think, madam, that you'd been reading an exciting story and that you just dropped off and waking a little confused?" Mrs. McGillicuddy interrupted him. "I saw it," she said. "I was as wide awake as you are, and I looked out the window into the window of the train alongside, and a man was strangling a woman. And what I want to know is, what are you going to do about it?" "Well, madam, you're going to do something, I suppose." The ticket collector sighed reluctantly and glanced at his watch. "We shall be in Brackhampton in exactly 7 minutes. I'll report what you've told me. In what direction was the train you mentioned going?" "This direction, of course. You don't suppose I'd have been able to see this if a train had flashed past going in the other direction?" The ticket collector looked as though he thought Mrs. McGillicuddy was quite capable of seeing anything anywhere as the fancy look took her, but he remained polite. "You can rely on me, madam," he said. "I will report your statement. Perhaps I might have your name and address, just in case." Mrs. McGillicuddy gave him the address where she would be staying for the next few days and a permanent address in Scotland, and he wrote them down. Then he withdrew with the air of a man who has done his duty and dealt successfully with a tiresome member of the travelling public. Mrs. McGillicuddy remained frowning and vaguely unsatisfied. Would the ticket collector report her statement? Or had he just been soothing her down? There were, she supposed vaguely, a lot of elderly women travelling around, fully convinced that they had unmasked communist plots, were in danger of being murdered, saw flying saucers in secret spaceships, and reported murders that had never taken place. If the man dismissed her as one of those... The train was slowing down now, passing over points and running through the bright lights of a large town. Mrs. McGillicuddy opened her handbag, pulled out a receipted bill, which was all she could find, wrote a rapid note on the back of it with her ball pen, put it into a spare envelope that she fortunately happened to have, stuck the envelope down and wrote on it. The train drew slowly into a crowded platform. The usual ubiquitous voice was intoning. "The train now arriving at platform 1 is the 5:38 for Milchester, Waferton, Rochester, and stations to Chatmouth. Passengers for Market Basing take the train now waiting at number 3 platform, number 1 bay for stopping train to Carberry." Mrs. McGillicuddy looked anxiously along the platform. So many passengers and so few porters. There was one. She hailed him authoritatively. "Porter, please take this at once to the station master's office." She handed him the envelope, and with it, a shilling. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back. Well, she had done what she could. Her mind lingered with an instant's regret on the shilling. 6 pence would really have been enough. Her mind went back to the scene she had witnessed. Horrible, quite horrible. She was a strong-nerved woman, but she shivered. What a strange, what a fantastic thing to happen to her. Elspeth McGillicuddy. If the blind of the carriage had not happened to fly up, but that of course was Providence. Providence had willed that she, Elspeth McGillicuddy, should be a witness of the crime. Her lips set grimly. Voices shouted, whistles blew, doors were banged shut. The 5:38 drew slowly out of Brackhampton station. An hour and 5 minutes later, it stopped at Milchester. Mrs. McGillicuddy collected her parcels in her suitcase and got out. She peered up and down the platform. Her mind reiterated its former judgment. Not enough porters. Such porters as there were seemed to be engaged with mailbags and luggage vans. Passengers nowadays seemed always expected to carry their own cases. Well, she couldn't carry her suitcase and her umbrella and all her parcels. She'd have to wait. In due course, she secured a porter. Taxi? There will be something to meet me, I expect. Outside Manchester Station, a taxi driver who had been watching the exit came forward. He spoke in a soft local voice. Is it Mrs. McGillicuddy? For St. Mary Mead. Mrs. McGillicuddy acknowledged her identity. The porter was recompensed, adequately if not handsomely. The car, with Mrs. McGillicuddy, her suitcase, and her parcels, drove off into the night. It was a 9-mile drive. Sitting bolt upright in the car, Mrs. McGillicuddy was unable to relax. Her feelings yearned for expression. At last, taxi drove along the familiar village street and finally drew up at its destination. Mrs. McGillicuddy got out and walked up the brick path to the door. The driver deposited the cases inside as the door was opened by an elderly maid. Mrs. McGillicuddy passed straight through the hall to where, at the open sitting room door, her hostess awaited her, an elderly, frail old lady. Elspeth! Jane! They kissed, and without preamble or circumlocution, Mrs. McGillicuddy burst into speech. Oh, Jane, she wailed, I've just seen a murder. 咁啊，呢個就係第一個 chapter 啦。咁好生動啦呢個 Agatha Christie 嘅文字好生動，個節奏非常之快同埋你睇佢嘅文字，你睇得出一個成個畫面出咗嚟嘅，一場戲出晒嚟嗰個畫面好豐富啦。佢冇刻意去描寫色彩佢冇刻意去描寫女性嘅衣着即係好多女作家會做呢啲嘢，佢亦都冇。佢係用一個巧妙嘅方法去交代出呢個女人嘅身份啦、社會地位啦、佢嘅家人啦即係佢同男性之間嘅態度啦，佢對待男性嘅態度啦，又或者佢一個咩性格嘅人啦，即係一個短短嘅一篇，佢又要交代嗰個兇殺案，佢又要交代嗰個場景咧就係火車啦，但係同一時間佢亦都可以描畫出呢個人物嘅一個周形，呢個係 Agatha Christie 嘅功力，所以即係最暢銷女作家呢個真係唔係浪得虛名嘅咁睇落去啦，咁啱啱就介紹咗呢個 Mrs. McGillicuddy 啦個姓氏都幾難讀，咁然之後就介紹多一個佢嘅朋友啦呢個叫阿 Jane 啦，咁仲有就係兇手啦同埋被害者啦，咁暫時就係呢幾個重要啲嘅人物啦咁之後睇下個故事點發展落去咁下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。